Hello, everyone. Welcome to another, albeit delayed, episode of the War Report. And we will just jump right into the news this week. There's not that much, but we're just going to get through it anyway. With the crisis in the Suez Canal. Now, one may think when they hear those words, the Egyptian government has taken action and closed the canal over a political issue, maybe with Israel, maybe with something else in the Middle East. But no, there's no political crisis going on right now. This was, and if you believe the official story, which I see no reason to disbelieve this just because it's so absurd, you kind of have to believe it. The canal is closed because Evergreen Shipping Company sent a massive ship. I believe it's one of the biggest in the world, if not the biggest container ship, called the Ever Given. That's been confusing for people. The Ever Given, which belongs to Evergreen, because you got Evergreen big on the side. I was confused myself at first. Has gone into the Suez Canal, but apparently has gotten itself wedged between it and has blocked trade through the canal for this past week. I think it was on Tuesday when the ship got stuck. But point being is, it's been something like they've been losing billions of dollars a day just on this one crisis. Now, this has forced a lot of shipping companies to travel around the Horn of Africa and the Cape of Good Hope to get their products to Europe, because this is mainly about shipping from East Asia into Europe. Now, as far as I know, a lot of the trade from like East Asia to the United States, of course, going across the Pacific and the Panama Canal, that's all fine, that's all clear because that's not blocked. But a lot of trade going from the Middle East, especially oil shipments, a lot of oil goes to the Suez Canal. And they were also joking that there's going to be another toilet paper shortage as a result of this insanity in the Suez Canal. And really, this is probably the one of the few stories, if not the only story I can think of in the show's history, where it's just by mere chance something happened, and like where there's not even that much speculation, because you could argue that the certain virus going around right now was by chance. Some say it's intentional. Some say, oh, it was created by X, Y, or Z. Whatever, fair enough. You can speculate about that, but this, it takes a long stretch to realize they sent in a ship that was too big for this canal. That, again, the last time the Suez Canal was blockaded was in 1956 by the Egyptian government over a political crisis involving the French and the British. And here we are right now by mere chance. Now, there's been a lot of suggestions on how to clear the canal or alternatives, and apparently one of the ones that's getting I see getting floated a lot, I think in a more tongue-in-cheek manner, is you build a canal on the other side of the Sinai Peninsula, mainly on Israeli territory. Now, wouldn't that be
Uh,
interesting? I wonder who would benefit from that. Really, that's a real head scratcher there with that one. But I do think it shows. I think it's more symbolic than anything, I should say, because
mhm.
just by mere chance, global trade, a significant amount of global trade, has been brought to a screeching halt by this one, what is ostensibly an accident. Now, they've made some progress on moving the ship, but honestly, everything they try is pathetic. Like the little like construction machinery they have trying to push it away. And, I'll be honest, I can't think of any way that isn't completely far fetched to free the canal. I mean, I think the best option at this point would honestly just be to torpedo the ship and send it to the bottom of the ocean so the rest of them can get through. I mean, you've already lost how much money on it? I mean, you've lost more than the goods are worth. At that point, what's a few more billion? Especially for the kind of people who would be able to ask the question, what's a few more billion? And I don't think there's any vital goods in there. I think it's mostly just consumer goods. And like I said, I think like you heard the things about the toilet paper. But it would honestly be Europeans affected the most. And again, you could see a situation where items for components of products from East Asia and the Middle East going to Europe. Europe sells those products to the United States. But you could see shortages on that end. But the majority of American trade, it seems like, will be fine. And it, it's again, I can't even go into the responses to this because there's not too many, because again, it's just by sheer chance. The Egyptian government is on it. The Israeli government is on. All the regional governments, allegedly, the White House is aware of the situation, or however much Biden can be aware of the situation, I should say. But I think the angle we're overlooking in all of this is, I think this calls into question the feasibility of such an expansive trade system by sea, because okay, trade's been done by sea ever since humans learned how to sail. We all know that. But on this scale, by no means. When the Suez Canal was built in the 1870s. It was meant to accommodate little steamships and like the early like oil ships. It was not built for these massive tankers. And there's arguments that maybe the canal should be expanded. Maybe we'll see that happen in the near future after this. But I think what it brings up is a debate that's been raging for a long time. What will this do for the land trade through the Middle East and through Russia, etc.? Well, I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative, I should just say. I think out of this sheer coincidence, the biggest winners are, no surprise, Russia and China, because China has been invested for what, the past 15 years now into building roads and railways and just way to transport goods across the land through the Eurasian landmass into Europe. I mean, they're trying to build that train from Hamburg to Shanghai, or Shanghai to Hamburg, whichever. And the other one is with all the oil that comes to the Suez, I mean, a pipeline running on land, maybe a little bit in the water, cough Nord Stream, that's going to be probably more secure than oil being controlled by this narrow waterway. And I think although it is an accident, it is a coincidence that what happened, that this is not a manufactured crisis, as far as we know, I should say, I think it does call into question how vital that trade route is and how really over dependent, especially Europeans are, on that one narrow canal that could be closed off at any moment by something like this or by a malicious actor. Say the Egyptian government, say Israel sees the Sinai again, goes further, blah blah blah. Say the U.S. Navy decides to blockade it for whatever reason, or say, I don't know, maybe China rises to this great naval power and decides to block the Suez. I think people are coming to realize that, yeah, sea trade, while it may be efficient, maybe we need to diversify a little. And I'm also curious to see how these trips around Africa go, because I know, especially off the Horn of Africa with Somalia, the U.S. Navy, among others, even North Korea, have engaged in anti-piracy operations to keep the seas clean so trade can continue. I'm really curious how this will affect piracy off the coast of Africa for depending on how long these ships have to go, because that could potentially be a big problem. U.S. Navy is big. It's not that big, though, in the current state of it. I mean, we just did a show a couple weeks ago on the state of the military brass and the U.S. military in general. I don't know, will this encourage other countries to set up their own like naval protection for these ships if they really are forced to go around Africa? Now, again, I doubt this is when I first saw this, I was like, oh, they'll have this blockage cleared in no time. And I'm still thinking, oh, yeah, they're going to have it cleared sooner than later, but I'm surprised it's gone on for as long as it has at this point. And I'm really starting to question, like, at this, like, I think back, like, oh, yeah, when this started, I thought, oh, yeah, no big deal. We're, what, 5, 6 days into it now? And who knows? Maybe a week from now, I'll be like, they still don't have it cleared. It's one of those sort of situations where you want to think, oh, yeah, this is an easy fix, but before you know it, it's been clogged for 3 months.
Yeah, like you. I'm surprised it's gone on this long, and it may just turn out that they'll have to torpedo it, or at least cut it into pieces. I mean, I sound horribly naive when I say that, but what other options are there? And to your point about a diversification of routes, other than sea routes, yeah, land routes are kind of like an obvious choice. Now they have their own hardships. Uh, there's the whole prospect of having to, cross multiple countries, and there's less of a security risk with a boat going through waterways that are controlled by whatever country, country X or whatever.
Yeah, and
And
in a broader scale by the U.S. Navy, but that's aside the point.
right, right. So it has its own challenges, but it's not unfeasible, and it has been done before. In fact, some of those routes still exist. They certainly exist, in our countries, in the States and in Canada. They're the groundwork that was laid for them, nearly 2 centuries ago is still there. Um, so Yeah, I mean, but of course, geopolitically, that would be a major challenge. It would be a major blow to the Western Bloc powers. It would certainly be a development that would favor multipolarism, and it would favor even Eurasianism.
Well, the
Um,
other proposal I've seen in that same vein is the North Sea route, with Russia and China developing these
yeah,
icebreakers to travel through the North Sea towards the North Pole and come down through it. Because believe it or not,
yes.
I was shocked when I forget the Earth is round, so we're able to do that. But with that out of the way, that's been another big one. It seems like again, this is how Putler wins. I don't know how he keeps on doing it, but yeah, again, land trade and North Sea trade is going to look a lot more attractive, especially because through the Middle East, through Central Asia, that can get treacherous, especially when you have a lot of these terrorist groups, a lot of instability, a lot of war. But shipping it from China through Russia, Far East into Europe, that's very feasible. And
Right. And China's already investing. I don't mean to interrupt, but has already begun investing in Arctic trade routes. So it's not like, it's not just something that's up in the air and nobody knows is going to happen. It already is happening. It's just, we're talking about upscaling it. Though last year we mentioned on one of our shows that 2020 marked the longest summer shipping season of 88 days that it was possible to traverse the Arctic Ocean on the Russian side and a little bit further out without the heavy use of icebreakers. So,
I'm telling you guys, this is why they fear climate change.
yes, yeah, oh, absolutely,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely,
There was some harebrained thing like they were going to try like their first sun dimming device at some point this week. I don't know whether that actually came to fruition, but the why I find this crisis in particular so interesting is not the localized event that's happening in the Suez Canal. That is interesting in and of itself, but I think it's interesting because it's something that is sheer coincidence, exasperating trends that have been going on observably at least for the past 2.5, 3 years, if not longer. Like I said, people were already looking for different ways. I mean, you already had these EU China trade deals. We're going to get into the Iran China trade deal. You already had Russia being sort of reintegrated, so to speak, into a lot of European economies, with especially the energy trade, things like Nord Stream, things like Turk Stream, etc. But again, it goes back to the symbolism of this. The
mm-hmm.
probably I don't know. I'd say it's more vital than the Panama Canal on a grand scale, because when it comes to again trade through America, there's other ways to do it. But I would say when it comes to global trade, the Suez Canal probably has more value of goods passed through it than the Panama Canal does. But point being is you
Yeah.
have, however you want to consider it, either the first or second most important waterway in the world being blockaded by something so unbelievably stupid,
hmm
and that just calls to attention the failing world order. And I don't know, maybe this is a testament to how far we've fallen. If this happened in the 90s, would we be able to clear this block just like that? Possibly. Maybe we would have a more coordinated response. Maybe Bubba Bill or good old George W would have been there, and the Suez Canal would have been cleared in no time. But it just seems like the marriage of a failing world order and the gross incompetence of the modern era coming
Yeah.
together in a union that is this. And really, like I said, the only two winners I see out of this in terms of broad concepts are Arctic trade and land trade through the Eurasian landmass, whether that be through Russia or through the Middle East.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think infrastructure for that will eventually be a reality in an upscale way rather than the low scale that it's on, particularly using trains. But to your point, you mentioned, for instance, um, about let's say control of resources. Um, you know, one of the reasons why civilizations initially flourished around rivers, but particularly in very hot and arid continents, let's say like the Tiger and the Euphrates, the Nile as well, uh, the Harappan culture in India. Well, I mean, one of the reasons why they could is, if a warlord or a king takes over that area, that's where the most precious amount of water exists, and everybody is going to need it. And you can put a premium on that price because you cannot win without water. What makes Europe and Russia fundamentally different is the plentitude of not only lakes, but of rain itself. Um, so that kind of civilization, um, I mean, of course, towns developed along riverways. Of course, I'm not suggesting that they didn't. I'm saying that they didn't manifest quite the same way that they did in the Middle East and in North Africa, right? Um, and I guess what I'm all this is just to basically underline how alternative methods of trade uh, diminish the power of one, great lord at the top of the hierarchy that can control a trade route, right? When there's other options, it naturally democratizes the system.
Oh no, for all we know, we're entering into a decade of privateers and sea piracy and all that good fun stuff we thought we cast off in the 18th century. And I'm being a little bit tongue in cheek about that, but I could seriously see with the rise in challenges to the US, whether it be on both sides, maybe China or whoever will try to undermine U.S. naval legitimacy by giving aid to, for example, Somali pirates or whatever, or the
Yeah,
U.S. will fund groups, again, mainly seabound groups, to harass Chinese vessels. Because we've been fighting these proxy wars. You want to go all the way back, like I said, we've been fighting these proxy wars since the discovery of the New World. That's where pirates come from, at least in the sense
hmm,
that we understand them.
absolutely.
Like, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a rise in this, and that if this is the new battlefield of this Cold War 2.0 we're supposedly in with China, is just hiring groups to harass these ships. And I think that also might be part of the strategy in Yemen. Maybe that's why Iran wants such a foothold on Yemen, so they can use these proxy groups to harass the U.S. Navy presence in the Gulf, in
Right.
the
They're pressure points.
oh, absolutely, like Gulf of
Yeah.
Aden, Red Sea, Persian Gulf, etc. All of these, like, despite Iran wanting again a neutralization of countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel as threats to them, I think this goes without saying they want to be able to maybe not confront the U.S. Navy head on. I think we've seen this through their military strategy. We've seen this through even U.S. war games. What was it? Millennium something Millennium where we had the war games against Iran 2003 where they sunk
Mhm.
the U.S. fleet within hours. But point being is that they want to be able to do those hit and run attacks on U.S. assets, which they do to an extent already, but they want to be able to have like a secure base of operations again, whether that be in the Gulf of Aden, whether that be in the Persian Gulf, whether that be Red Sea, off the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, wherever. And I think out of all this one, albeit large boat getting stuck, costing the world economy billions upon billions of dollars, I think the more important realization here is really how fragile sea trade is when it's been something that's really been accepted as a fact of life for the past three quarters of a century. Ever since the end of World War II, it's been sort of accepted that the United States will guard global trade. And I think even by accident, even by coincidence, people are realizing maybe the system is not invulnerable as we previously thought it was.
Yeah, I mean, as you pointed out earlier, there does seem to be this confluence of ineptitude, um, coinciding with basically challenges to America's leadership. I mean, we've been in many ways mapping out of this rising tide since Trump's election victory, where um, Even America's allies and vassals have begun squabbling with themselves. Many of them are trying to get the best that they can out of America while it lasts. Some are already looking elsewhere, but the confidence isn't there. Um, the confidence is lacking, and by almost every metric, if you um, really look at American policy, whether it's rooting out white nationalism within the military, everything seems to suggest that the main theater in the 2020s for America will be internal rather than external. Uh, you know, uh, there are still the National Guard troops guarding the White House with a very expanded perimeter.
Yeah, but not the rest
Uh,
of DC as we saw this week. I mean,
yeah.
apparently, violent crime in the
Yes.
streets, putting DC under martial law, that doesn't prevent that. But the QAnon shaman, he has to be driven out of the presence of DC, and that's why our our best and brightest, the National Guard, are really there to stand watch and keep things safe.
Yeah. Yeah. There is a sense. Even the lockdowns, which are kind of ironically named after, like, I mean, that terminology first appeared actually in prisons. But even, the lockdowns in and of themselves are kind of like an acceleration towards dealing with a kind of impending fallout. That's, I think, how many people see it, and I think, generally speaking, they're right.
Look, all I'm saying is we don't have to get concerned until they start broadcasting Swan Lake on the TV for 12 hours a day.
And then Butler has taken over.
Well, okay, maybe that's okay. I need an American equivalent until they start. I don't know. Name some black pop culture figure that's popular right now. I'm too old for this. Trust me. I'm not even that old. I'm too old for this. And yeah, that's when we'll know. Like when you see like the who was again whichever popular one that they're all outraged about again. Whenever you see that on the TV for like 12 hours a day, that's when you know we're under true martial law. That's when you know the coup is underway. And I don't know, maybe that's the Q people, maybe that's the force of global homogenization, so to speak. And yeah, that's when you really start getting concerned. But with that all being said, I think what we need to look at is with internal security in the U.S., the whole border crisis and how Biden is just trying to be the best humanitarian he can by putting these children in these overflow detainment facilities or whatever they're calling them. Which a lot of people again the instinct of at least the establishment right is to say I cannot believe that Trump and his I cannot believe that Biden and his people would do this. It's so horrible. When really they should have been sticking to the line. Under Trump, they said, well, this was Obama's policy. And really, they should be sticking to the line that what other choice do we have to put these people in, again, terrible conditions, but really, when they're coming across in such high numbers and we're supposed to weed through them all, what else are we supposed to do with them? This could be a great argument right now, and you see some people making this for maybe we need a physical barrier on the border to keep the families together on the other side of the border, or maybe we need to be able to turn people away at the border and not take in everyone who allegedly has an asylum claim, whatever that even means at that point. And you've been seeing a lot of reversals of the policies with Mexico under the Biden administration, which, to Trump's credit, he got Mexico and some of these other Central American countries to agree to house these so-called migrants. But really, it's been fascinating with the reaction to Biden because again, you hear nothing from the genuine open borders people who would have been shrieking, crying if this was Trump, and you also have the right, as usual, the right serving the role as controlled opposition, failing to make the vital arguments they could very easily make right now. And really, again, they put Biden in front of the press. He looks like he's half alive, as usual, and what you'd expect ensues.
Yeah, I mean, he also got mostly softball questions. Um, though they were in some regards a little more professional than they had been. I mean, for crying out loud, some of the other questions have been, how's his wife doing? His dog? Yeah, it's so. But that said, I think it was mostly softballs. There was one particularly, you know, I wouldn't say difficult question about migration and open borders, or rather border problems. That could have been done basically so that no one could accuse him of having only softball questions posed to him. But as you mentioned, the blame will always be placed on the previous president about this situation. Part of the problem also is that during the Obama, and Republicans are just as guilty of this, but policies that continue to destabilize Central America, although they don't get the attention that they did in the 80s and early 90s.
Yeah, making
But
sure the cocoa companies can save a few bucks while not cutting costs. Again, these sort of corporations who, they hit you from two sides. They destabilize these countries through the U.S. government, then they lobby the U.S. government to bring in these refugees and migrants as cheap labor. And again, it's that left-right punch you get from both sides.
yeah,
You got
yeah,
or what is traditionally the role of the right is to embark on these destabilizing interventions or funding these groups or whatever. Whereas you have the left coming in as the humanitarian saying we need to take in all these people whose countries destabilized. Again, similar case to the Middle East, but again, much more immediate. You saw this recently with Venezuela in the past 2 years.
yeah. I'm really glad actually that you brought up the comparison with the Middle East because in many ways there's some similarities also have an inverted aspect to them. Like with Syria, the whole point was that the West, particularly Europe, should not forget about Syria. And so one of the ways to remind them that Syria was not resolved was to have one of the largest migrations in hundreds of years flowing into Europe, right? But the point of that was to remind you of Syria. um, Now, it didn't work because what it did is it ushered in a cultural war that bore striking similarities to that of the States,
Yeah, and even
but with its own,
backfired in some places like Hungary and to lesser extent as countries like France and Italy and Germany.
right, red and blue states within the EU. And so uh, that backfired on them because the refugees in and of themselves did not delegitimize Russia's presence in Syria. Nor did it do that for Iran's presence in Syria. In effect, what it did is it delegitimized NATO's help of America within Syria. And it delegitimized their domestic governments as well. So it totally backfired on them, and they had to stop. I mean, migrants still come in, but they're careful about it. The difference, of course, here is they must like here it's strictly a moral issue. It's a shibboleth to figure out what someone's moral compass or political ideology. So they don't want you to really think about which countries they're coming from and why this problem's there because America will play a role in that. So it becomes simply a moral issue about poor people that are in desperation, that need to get onto your property for help, right? So there is a contrast. There are also some
Yeah, and if
similarities.
you want an idea of how these were crocodile tears, I think it was in 2019 where Poland was actually making deals with the Syrian government to resettle refugees in the peaceful parts of Syria, in the parts of Syria where, again, Assad and his forces have won.
Yeah.
And you had no coverage of this, and any coverage you have of it was
Yep.
negative. But taking in people, unwashed masses who may be Syrian, may not even be Syrian, whatever, that is the right humane thing to do. But again, and I know pointing out hypocrisy is one of the lowest arguments, but just to show you where we're at, I don't like to do this, but just show you where we're at. When you had Poland, I believe Hungary, and a few other Central European countries getting in on this deal to make an agreement with the Syrian government on getting serious people back home, that was
Hmm.
given no coverage. That was given no support by the West. And again, I think that really just shows their true agenda. And I don't think anyone
Yes.
who watches the show needs to hear this, but I will say it anyway. It was never about helping the quote unquote refugees. It was never about humanitarianism. Again, there were multiple reasons for this. Some corporations wanted these people as workers. Some European governments wanted these people to make up for the pensions because Europeans aren't having enough children. Again, a political wedge by inserting a population there that you can get to vote for your party or whatever. But point being is, at the end of the day, it was never about humanitarianism. It was about the same thing it always is. All of these issues, preserving the liberal global order. Now, I believe it has backfired. One thing you have to realize when you talk about these things is you can point out that the liberal global order did something, but it did not work out to their benefit. Because you know why? They're a very powerful organization, but they're not infallible and they're not all powerful. They're capable of making mistakes, which is why they're in a free fall right now. And when you point out the power of certain groups, a lot of people will say, like, well, if they're so powerful, how did this happen? Because they can still make mistakes, they can still miscalculate. The greatest and brightest minds, the greatest conquerors, have miscalculated at some point. Sometimes to their downfall, other times to a slight detriment. And I believe we may be seeing one of the cases where the people who run the world, especially the liberal world order, especially the Western world, have made a series of grave mistakes over the past 2 decades, but you want to localize it more over the past 5 years.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. And you can see there is a sense of hurriedness that has been taking place that I think was visible even prior to Trump getting in, but it certainly accelerated after his victory. And then during COVID, that too is there. And it's a very broad acceleration. It's cultural, it's everything from accepting lockdowns as a normal way of life. People can make the argument about how it probably saved lives, but people do not make the argument about what happens with the next pandemic, or why have there not been more hospitals built for such an emergency into the future.
Yeah, we had very band aid solutions, mask and health
Very band-aid
mandates,
solutions. You
stay at
think if
home
it
for
was,
6 weeks, whatever.
yeah.
And at the end of the day, like a lot of the stuff we were talking about this time last year, like look at the shortage of ventilators the U.S. has had since 2006. Look at the shortage in medical supplies. Look at how woefully we underprepared. Since my take around this time last year, maybe like February 2020, was you know what, this might not be that bad, but I think what it's going to expose is that we're woefully underprepared for any real crisis. My attitudes changed throughout, March, April 2020, but by spring, summer, I decided like, okay, yeah, they overblew this. They don't know what they're talking about. But I think the biggest lesson I have learned personally is that they're grossly incompetent. They are not prepared for a crisis of this scale or any crisis of any significant scale, whether that be health, whether that be political, whether that be economic. This is fundamentally an empire in decline. And I didn't even go partisan with it. I didn't say, oh, Nancy Pelosi. I didn't say, oh, Trump. I mean, not that I'm particularly a fan of either. But point being is, as what happens in liberal democracies, partisanship help deflect the blame from the actual system. If an opposition is a threat to the
Yes,
system, they're not
yes.
allowed to exist. That's why it's all controlled opposition. To the point where, rather than looking at this country as our state apparatuses, our bureaucracies, and saying these people have no idea what they're doing and we're trusting our lives to them, it was vote for Biden and he'll solve the situation. And again, very early on, we saw a lot of the chagrin and disappointment of Biden voters. Or if we only keep Trump in office, he'll make America great again. And again, I think this goes back to my fundamental gripe. One of my fundamental gripes with liberal democracy is the abdication of responsibility and the deflection of blame being built into the system.
Hmm. Yeah, and I also think it's just a complete kind of lack of awareness about how much the situation on the ground has changed, right? It's little things like, not creating new trade routes because that would have an effect on certain monopolies that already pre-exist, or you have something like COVID, which freezes everything to a halt and but you don't bring back pharmaceutical manufacturing into the country, right?
or any
Or
manufacturing.
right, or you don't create more hospitals for emergency situations like this, and it comes actually after you've had technocrats predicting stuff like this from 20 years ago. We've had a year of who pressers, other well-regarded doctors telling you that this is the future, that as cities grow, we will probably expect more of this, not less. And yet there's no preparation. It's almost like maybe it's not that deadly, or maybe it's not that worth getting serious about. To say nothing of the BLM protests, right?
Oh, absolutely
Uh,
not.
so yeah, you do not have any sense of confidence that's emerging out of this. And I think the real cherry on the top was the discrepancy of the 2020 election.
Yeah, and
You know,
honestly, I think the only thing saving us from the evil clutch of Bill Gates is the gross incompetence of the system he is working through. Frankly,
mhm.
I think a lot of people fear, like, especially with the vaccine rollouts, which we'll get into. Like, well, is it going to be required? What are going to be the effects of this? Maybe I don't want to take this, etc. And again, I'm not telling you to do anything otherwise. I'm not in a position to do that. And again, for our friends at YouTube, I'm not making any medical statements or medical advice. But point being is, I think the ideas of a vaccine passport, whether that's proposed by the people who oppose it or the people who genuinely support it, I don't think we live in a system competent enough to carry it out. I think if they did try that, there would be a lot of people who slipped through the cracks, a lot of people with forgeries, a lot of easy ways to get around it. Not that I would ever advocate anything illegal or against a company policy. No, never. But again, I think although the fear may be real and there might be some idea that, yeah, maybe somebody's trying to do this, I don't think the government or any major corporation would be even capable of enforcing such a system.
Yeah, that's a fair point. We've usually people, when there's a tremendous mistrust of their leaders and leadership in general, their institutions. We ascribe far more to malice than to incompetence, and it's only going to become trickier. Maybe less tricky, as incompetence will probably explain more of why things are happening rather than pure malice. Not that there isn't malice behind this. There is, of
Yeah.
course. Um,
I would say it's again that marriage of incompetence and self-interest, which usually manifests itself into malice, creating this
mhm.
byproduct.
Well put.
Because like again, you can have a well-meaning but incompetent system, and they'll usually be able to scrape out something, or a malicious but pragmatic system, an effective system that will give enough table scraps to keep the people at bay. But I think it is when you combine the incompetence and the malice is when you get the trouble, which I think explains pretty much post 9/11 America and
Mhm.
post 9/11 Western world. Let me just be clear about that. But speaking
Right.
speaking of vaccine rollouts, apparently Germany is having a shortage now. I don't know if they have on. I imagine they would be one of few countries in Europe that would actually tilt this way. Decided to bite the bullet and go for Sputnik vaccines or Russian vaccines in general. I know they were considering Chinese ones, but yes, the vaunted German efficiency, number one, did not produce a vaccine. Number two, has a vaccine shortage based on the, again, factors of the outside world. And, it has been interesting because one of the Western countries, maybe not necessarily the German government, but like Germans as a whole, as a nation, they've been pretty good on the pushback against this whole thing, and I'm wondering maybe that's why I haven't seen the opinion polls on how many of them actually would take a vaccine or whatever. But point being is you're seeing this crisis, which is allegedly the worst health crisis we've had since the Spanish flu, and you're not allowed to buy vaccines from X, Y, or Z country because that would increase political influence. That would do X, Y, or Z. When again, I keep on going back to this point. If it's such a vital task, if time is of the essence, it doesn't
Hmm.
seem like they have the time to be bickering. This seems like one of those things where even the bitterest of rivals would put aside their differences, at least temporarily, to solve this crisis. Now, again, maybe they may use that to sabotage each other at some point down the road, but again, if you're so desperate, even if your enemy is offering you a deal that will come back to bite you in 5 to 10 years, but if you're desperate, if you need them there now, you'll usually you'll usually plug your nose and sign it, just stomach it and deal with the consequences as they come. And seeing as that how that has not happened, I don't think this is the case. And this is again one of my other big points of skepticism I keep on returning to is that like I said, if it was that dire, even if so let's say hypothetical scenario, China goes up to Germany, since we're talking about Germany, and says, "Oh, we'll make up for your vaccine deficit if you do X, Y, and Z for us. That's going to be very taxing on your nation. It's going to be a very parasitic relationship in our benefit." If the Germans were that desperate, if it was the Black Plague or whatever, they would take the deal. They would not be happy about it, and they would deal with the consequences as they came along. But obviously, it's not that big of a deal when no number one, no deal like that has been made by Russia, China, the U.S., whoever. Nobody has made that sell your soul for some vaccine deals and get on. It depends on how esoteric you want to get on it, but that's beside the point. I don't really like to delve into that kind of stuff in the show. I don't think I'm really well read enough. Maybe someday, but today's not that day. But again, going back to that point is it is interesting seeing the sort of the liberal media, the mainstream media's turn against even the Merkel German government, even like the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats in power in Germany right now, and like the very mainstream center left, center right parties that rule that country. It's very weird because not only this, I've seen a few other things, especially in relation to Nord Stream, sort of the media assault on Germany currently.
Yes, yes, and it is interesting that I mean, Biden did write an op-ed back in. Well, I mean, it might have been written at the end of 2019, but it wasn't published until March 2020. And it's amazing. It's almost word for word rhetoric. Like we will press China on human rights violations and the Uyghurs. Notice they were very quiet about it during the Trump administration because that would have, well, it would have looked like bipartisanship, and of course you can't have bipartisanship with Cheeto Hitler. So what they did instead is they waited for it, and so that rhetoric had already been out, and you hear that rhetoric now, and as you pointed out, they're getting tough on Germany. Blinken was there, I think, a week
Oh,
or like.
I got a story about Blinken, but continue.
Well, yeah, I mean, he visited heads of the EU and was basically talking about sanctions on Germany if they continue with Nord Stream 2, like um, showing great disfavor of the recent trade agreement between the EU and China. I mean, you get the sense that remember how surprised I was. I thought Germany would cave because Germany historically, post World War II, has been like one of the most obedient countries to American power. Whether that's been inner or outer circle governments that have been in the White House, it's just generally been very consistent. And lo and behold, they're sticking to it, as it were. Which your only conclusion could be is like either the U.S. is playing some incredible 4D chess right now, or a lot of allies, partners, vassals, whatever, um, are kind of instigating their own path. That they're showing a certain amount of independent action.
Yes, and again, I would, as I believe you would, attribute that to fighting over the table scraps of this empire in decline because I've pointed this out several times. This is the time for those secondary powers like Japan, like Turkey, Germany, France, etc., to start staking their claims on being for now at least, the managers of American assets in that region. Turkey can take on the role of interventionist in the Middle East and keeping Russia at bay. Germany and France, whether that be together, whether it be like in sort of an adversarial relationship, can take on the role of governing Europe through the European Union. Japan can take on America's East Asian responsibilities. So the political leaders with foresight, people again like Erdogan, like Macron in particular, and it is funny because you do get head clashing between these groups quite often, are looking at the situation on the ground, looking at the situation within the United States. It's really started under Trump, but this started evidently under Trump. It was going on before that, but people didn't realize it until Trump said, this is a good opportunity as America overexpands and as its sentiments at home become more isolationist to really again stake ourselves at least as the successor empire in this region. It's probably going to be a very ham-fisted comparison what I'm going to do right here, but sort of like Alexander's generals fighting over his domains after he
Mm,
dies. Like that's what it feels like to me.
I felt that.
Yes, resident Macedonian, of course.
uh, that's a good point. Uh, but I think America is already aware that the cost of doing that will mean, amongst many things, just a loss of prestige. That's what we're kind of seeing symbolically, is the loss of American prestige on the on the global theater. So, I mean, I understand it, right? Like, if you understand, like, if one comes to terms with the policy that is really temporary, that yeah, you restructure the economy, maybe you retool a manufacturing capitalist economy, but it seems like the that the
Which,
world is
funny
leaving
enough,
all of
this
that
was all
behind.
the in my like from my observation at least, this was all pretty much the grand strategy Michael Flynn had going into the Trump administration. And like I said, if I believe that okay, they'll still keep up their rage about Trump until pretty much the end of the world. But I
Yeah.
believe that deep in their hearts and behind closed doors, they they've had to come to the realization at some point that maybe they dislike Trump, but the people Trump surrounded himself, for example, Michael Flynn, from their perspective, would have been actually a very good thing for them in the long term. Short term, they would have lost quite a bit. The American empire would have retracted quite a bit. American influence prestige would have retracted quite a bit, but it could have weathered the storm that was coming. That
Hmm.
Trump, I believe, in his buffonishness, realized was coming just by, I don't know, maybe business instinct or something. Somebody, again, like Flynn and like, what was it, Carter Page, who we wanted to make the ambassador to Germany or whatever. But again, these people originally on Trump's team, I think they had a bit of foresight and they said, you know what, we might have to hunker down for a little bit. Maybe we can't continue this world superpower thing, but we can continue to be a force in the world and actually be able to project American power. But they threw that away because, again, they got too ambitious, they got too greedy. Same thing that happens with, I would say, every empire. Every empire reached the point where it can either A, retract and maybe come back again someday, maybe, again, go into hiding, go into hibernation, so to speak, or it can ride this train until the wheels fall off. It can keep going until they crash or again until this thing comes tumbling down. However many analogies I can put to this, and it looks like they chose option B in this case. And let me tell you, option B is a lot more rapid than I would have thought it's been. I know I've been repeating myself, and I've been a broken record for the past year at this point. But what else can I say, honestly?
This raises for me 2 points. One is a CSIS, I believe it's the Center for Strategic Institute something something. It's a think tank. It's closely aligned with NATO, various NGOs, and of course the U.S. It's very similar to the Atlantic Council, which is more specifically it's the NATO think tank. Basically, that's what the Atlantic Council is. Anyways, they were having an hour and a half long meeting and a distinguished guest joined their Zoom call for the last 33 minutes. And they talked about China. They said conflict is very low to almost unlikely, and that that shouldn't mean that there aren't going to be um, contested areas in the South China Sea. That there would be challenges, but the most important and salient point he made was that we should not merely like not only should we not alienate China, but in fact, if we affect China economically, that would actually be bad for us as well as Europe and the rest of the world, or the world that they conceive. Um, so in a sense, it tells you that despite all the rhetoric about the Quad, about naming the South Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, and all these clever word games. The truth is that America is still, well wrapped in China America, and any abrupt strategy that would be economically damaging to China would invariably be economically damaging to the U.S. as well. So it's a very tough nut to crack for them, and I think China is very aware of this. Plus, you mentioned hubris, and I'd like to tie in the kind of rhetoric that was going on in the late '80s and '90s about the Soviet use of various let's say American liberal strategies of previous American injustices to the indigenous people of America and the way blacks are treated, slavery, the whole thing. So that's a common refrain. And if we remember the Alaska summit that took place a couple of weeks ago, the Chinese used the same rhetoric, right? And although this is a rhetoric that was used by countries to appeal to the left in America, right? It was well known by the mid '90s and late '90s that this strategy, that America aired this strategy, was no longer just a sign of red state rhetoric. It was no longer a sign of the outer party taking over. The blue party, the inner party, basically was echoing that sentiment, right? That yeah, talk all you want about that, but you're just trying to divide our country. Now, Blinken said the same thing at the Alaska summit. But to get back to hubris, so why do I bring this up? I bring this up because you would think that if this was a weakness that had to be addressed by America, you would think America becoming more diverse would maybe, as a strategy, geopolitical strategy, not be a good thing until it's preeminent hierarchical domination of the world was just something that could not be contested. And I suppose in the '90s, that was the consensus, that was the case, and they could move forward. So, that rhetoric is now useful to countries that normally needed the sympathies of the left in America. They know they're not going to get those sympathies anymore because the struggle is very different now. But they know that also both parties have to defend this. And they also know that America's intercultural conflict is a very, very serious thing. It is more serious, or as serious, as the expansion of China, without question.
Oh, absolutely. And I think speaking of China, we can bring it around to our Middle Eastern news with Iran and Syria. So, for starters, China and Iran have signed a $400 billion 25-year cooperation deal. Now, the deal mainly involves China will, of course, get their oil from Iran and in exchange invest economically into Iran. And this is I would say, a direct snub of Biden's desires to resurrect the Iranian nuclear agreement. I see no other way around it. I see no ifs, ands, or buts. The fact that Biden comes in, he strikes those Iranian groups in Syria and says, "Okay, I'm ready to talk," and then China comes in just a few weeks later and says, "We'll cut you this deal. Money, oil, simple as." And really, again, I think we both predicted this happened when they scrapped the Iran deal and then the events preceding that there wouldn't necessarily be a war with Iran. Iran wouldn't be economically strangled, but it would become situated tightly, economically at least, with Russia and China. And I
Mhm.
think that's exactly what's happened. I think China more so. China has more of the economic muscles to flex, whereas Russia, I would say, they're probably more militarily competent in terms of if Iran needed a great power to guarantee existence against, I don't know, threats from Israel or the United States or whatever, somebody who can really like negotiate on their behalf from a diplomatic standpoint. But you had that happen, and really, I don't think this surprised anyone. This has been under the way for a while. They've been signing several deals, but I guess this is just the final concrete one that really solidifies that. And I think beyond whatever empty threats Biden or the next GOP president has, the Iran situation has fundamentally solved itself. I don't think any amount of hand wringing, pardon the pun, out of Tel Aviv or Washington or wherever is going to solve the crisis. I think the Iran conflict, beyond of course the proxy conflicts that will still go on in Syria and Yemen, those will continue. But I think the overarching threat of war with Iran or any sort of major conflict has been put to rest by not only this deal in particular, but the past year of Iranian cooperation with Russia and especially China. And really, again, I think this chapter's over in terms of this. Now, I could be wrong. Biden could fly off the handle, or who knows, President Kamala could fly off the handle and take us to war with Iran or do whatever, or implement some massive clandestine program to undermine the Iranian regime. But for now, honestly, I know I've said this before, I really don't see where it goes forward beyond current status quo.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, you could you could well imagine. I now again, I stress not a war, not a conflict, but a struggle over Taiwan nonetheless, where America has to decide if this is the hill that it wants to maybe not die on, but fight on, and China's sort of waiting it out.
Yeah, I mean, you even had leaked evidence apparently of Trump saying, "Well, we couldn't defend Taiwan. There's no way in hell we could do that." And it pretty much his exact words. But I think
Yes.
these were from 2019 when they were again he was being briefed on the strategic situation. And really, sometimes it takes that buffoonish sort of layman looking at the situation, looking at these maps, all these troops and these little model aircraft carriers on them, and saying like, there's no way we could defend this against the might of China. If China really won Taiwan tomorrow, they could have it. And really, beyond a nuclear war, there's nothing we could do. And I think that holds true. I think that holds true of Russia and Crimea, Russia and the Ukraine in general, for being honest. And
Hmm.
again, I do think American capabilities to defend our so called allies have not really increased that much since the Cold War. I think the furthest east, at least in Europe, now this is just pure speculation, that we would be able to defend is somewhere like Poland. I don't think we'd be able to defend Ukraine. I don't think we'd be able to defend a lot of Eastern European countries if push came to shove. The Baltic, Russia could have that tomorrow if they wanted to, and obviously they don't. Taiwan, they could have it. Korea is an interesting situation with North Korea and its nuclear power. A lot of the situation in the South China Sea and Southeast Asia in general may be a little bit more of a fight there. But realistically, Russia and especially China, I would say they're poised to really take any action they want. It's just when is the right time to call the bluff of the U.S. and is there a madman crazy enough in the White House to press that red button? Now that's the air Trump put on, especially with a country like North Korea, that like my button's bigger than yours, Kim, and mine probably actually works. And I think Trump, at least early on, he had that aura of a madman. He said sort of like the Kissinger strategy. But I think shortly afterwards they realized, oh, he's all talk, he's all bark and no bite. But with somebody like Biden, who is again sort of functioning at, I don't know, 30%. I don't think that's a chance they want to take. Or somebody like Kamala, who is really uppity or whatever, and really high on her own supply, if you will, and would want to prove herself, be the strong minority woman, first woman president out there to stand up and play with the big boys. Like again, I think they. Funny enough, I think despite the GOP rhetoric on China, if China were to ever claim Taiwan, let's say within the next decade, it would be under a Republican president because again, I think that anyone the Democrats would put up has too much of an ideological investment in the empire at this point. I'm not saying that doesn't exist on the Republican side, especially a Republican that would become president, but I think they would be more wavering in it. Whereas you tried that with somebody like Joe Biden, who is again a few screws loose and eager to prove himself. One of these strong and independent women, such as Kamala Harris, or again, you can supplement China and Taiwan for Russia and Ukraine or Russia and the Baltic, whatever you want to say. But my ultimate point about this, again, goes back to the decline of American imperial power, is I doubt they would be able to defend it. But getting back to the Middle East, because that's where, and again, that's what I would say. This same situation applies to Iran. I don't think that under a Democrat or a Republican that this would happen. And I saw somebody point out the other day, and I tend to agree with this take. I wish I remembered who it was so I could give them credit. That a significant American retraction is going to happen within the next 10 years, but it will take the form of a Democrat pushing America's luck and pushing us over the edge and frying our credibility with some war, some major diplomatic disputes, or it's going to be a Republican who succumbs to so-called isolationism, and when some crisis breaks out in the Middle East or East Asia or Eastern Europe, they just throw up their hands and say, you know what, I don't care, there's nothing we can do about this. And I'm inclined to say, those are both pretty good possibilities at this point, especially after a Trump presidency, because again, not to take this rant on too much longer, I do believe if Russia went all in for Ukraine or China went all in for Taiwan, I think Trump may have talked a big game, but I really don't see. I don't think he would have responded in any way beyond, I don't know, sanctions or some other slap on the wrist thing. I don't think he would have been pressing the red button. I don't even think he would have put that much of a concerted military response into it. Maybe I exaggerate, but point being is, and you add another decade to that, another, let's say, Trump-minded Republican. I don't see any way, any possibility under that there would be a response. Or on the other side, an overzealous democratic response, dragging Europe or our East Asian allies into a conflict they want no business in. But at the end of the day, again, I think this China-Iran deal, bringing it all back together, the circle back, as our wonderful press secretary would say, uh, I think this, again, closes this chapter of the American empire, at least in terms of our dealings with Iran.
Yeah, you barely see it addressed, and one of the reasons for that is that it would be embarrassing. Um, and of course, the the reasoning for it will be that America isn't even acting coherently. And again, it's because there are too many internal divisions and they go right to the top. So Obama's administration has one approach, the Trump administration had another. Although, to be fair, the GOP, the rhinos in the GOP, wanted him to do this, and he fully wanted to do it anyways. Uh, but he killed the JPCOA, and that it's the same story that we've seen where the West keeps pushing Russia towards China, which, for the most part, benefits China. Uh, of course, China and Russia could never form uh, a formal alliance, a formal military alliance. Um, if that would happen, there would be incredible fallout. One would be, for instance, although Russia and other countries like Iran and even Switzerland has already created an alternative to the SWIFT banking system. Um, Most of Russian companies haven't switched over, and so that would be a definite shock to the system, and it would force the West to isolate China. It would have a very, very disruptive effect. Russia's good diplomatic relations with North and South Korea, with Japan, with India. Sometimes, that's even at odds with China, would have a definite effect on Russia, and it would put the West into another difficult situation to choose which side, because now they can't choose a side, and harming China will harm them. And it's why the strategy has always been, even prior to the 20th century, but especially during the Cold War and after. The idea is that you never secede Europe to Russia at any cost, and that the only way to contain China and to dictate to China what it must or mustn't do is to remove Russia from the picture. That without Russia there, the ability to bully China is more possible.
And with that being said, I believe we can move on to our Syria news. Now, more of the usual, again, more ICE attacks. Offenses continue in northwestern Syria. Turkish forces continue their incursion into Syria and again fighting amongst the Kurd groups. Pretty business as usual. Couple interesting pieces of news. I'll start with the more recent, more relevant one first. That Iranian oil shipments to Syria have been blocked in the Suez Canal. So that's one consequence of this story, which again we went over at the beginning of the show, and I said all I had to say about it. And we'll see how that goes. I know they're getting also oil from Russia being shipped through the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, whatever. And the second is Greece, of all countries, has called on foreign troops to be removed from Syria. Now, I believe this is a comment mainly aimed at Turkey. They didn't clarify. For example, they said all foreign troops want to be removed, but again,
Mm.
it didn't seem like they were calling on Russian troops to be removed. And
That might explain the latest Caspian Report video.
interesting. I don't think it.
Here's why um, Greece is worse off from seceding from the Turkish Empire.
Oh yes, that one. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Here's why
Oh,
Greek.
so you're saying Russia should have Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
They're worse
You're
off.
telling me statelets are a bad thing and that we should return to empires. Okay. I think those fine folks might be onto something. But with that being said, um, again, I think this continues. This is just another proxy battlefield. Again, Syria being turned into a proxy battlefield again for Greek and Turkish relations. So
Yes,
I
yeah. That is what it is at the end of the day.
Yeah, and again, Greece also is one of the ones that bears the brunt of these migrants now. They don't necessarily settle in Greece, but they trudge their way through Greece. Is again, when Turkey opens up those floodgates, they go through that. They go through the Balkans. That's why you see countries like Hungary, Slovenia, Slovakia, etc., Croatia. And I don't know how. I think Serbia also had some. I don't know. I don't think. I think they usually go around Serbia. And, I don't really blame them. I think the
Mhm.
history there says a lot. Look, if I had to traverse the Balkans, which I wouldn't want to in the first place, I would try to go around Serbia too. Is my point. But that being said, you're seeing again more usual in Syria. Things have been pretty quiet since the last major incident, which were the Biden strikes on Syria and the follow up therefore. But they are again rationing fuel now, and the one definitive thing I will say about Syria this week is I think this may bring some of the offenses to a slowdown, not necessarily a halt, with the delay in fuel shipments, depending on how much of that Russia can make up. And I know, of course, Iran has been a big supplier of that oil into Syria, so we'll have to see when the Suez Canal gets unblocked, or maybe the Iranians will try to traverse through Iraq as they did during the Trump administration, which led to there were a lot of strikes on Iranian oil convoys going through Iraq into Syria. I mean, their hand may be forced if this Suez crisis continues on for too much longer. Which again, I genuinely have no idea when and how or you know this crisis is going to be resolved. I'm at a loss. Everyone thinks they'd be able to solve this crisis, but I'm gonna say beyond putting a torpedo in the hull of that ship, I don't really see a solution any other way at that point. Unload how many containers you can, work out the details of that, and just sink the thing. But I'm retreading. Pardon the pun. I'm retreading waters here. But one last thing I wanted to cover before we go off air is not exactly a news event, but just a little bit of a biography on our current Secretary of State. Now, of course, that's Anthony Blinken, and his
Hmm.
stepfather was Samuel Pizar, and again, this is all from Wikipedia of all places, so truly unbiased source, I know. But Blinken again attended Dalton School in New York City until 71, moved to Paris with his mother and stepfather Samuel Pizar, who is an attorney, and Pizar again he did a lot of work with the Kennedy administration in the 60s, and I believe even later the Johnson administration, and the French government, and just, again, very business interested. One of these high rollers, one of these, again, professional negotiator types. And he was also a confidant of Robert Maxwell, the infamous spy who worked for the KGB, the Mossad, the CIA, again, all these, pretty much whatever intelligence agency would have him, he cooperated with at some point. And he was the last person he spoke to before Mr. Maxwell's tragic boating accident. As we all know, Robert Maxwell is the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, who was the
Yep.
mistress of Jeffrey Epstein. But
What a small world.
it goes further because Pizar also played the intermediary between Epstein and various government and business interests, and throughout his time working for these different French firms, everything like that. But yeah, what a small world. And fact check me on this if I'm wrong. Get the debunkers out here. But apparently, the Dalton school that Pizar attended, the
Yes.
administrator of that was Bill Barr's father. And of course, Bill Barr is the former attorney general under both Bush Sr. and Trump, who also allegedly has ties to Epstein. All these people have one thing in common. It's a very ethnic, sort of tribal thing. I don't think I'm allowed to discuss too much in depth, but again, it all just comes together, and everyone has their theories on Epstein. Everyone has this, but again, at the end of the day, I, I mean, I think this you have pretty much irrefutable evidence of all these people being tied together. Now, what they're tied together for is like when you can really start speculating. But again, our current Secretary of State, former confidant of the father of Epstein's mistress, both of whom were, again, both Maxwell's were agents for Israeli intelligence, which leads me to believe that Biden, maybe Biden's pro-zero policy, maybe it differs so much from the Obama government with the Likud party. Maybe their tension is gone because maybe they have one of their guys in there. Trump administration, they had Kushner. Kushner was very friendly. Would that be good old, Charles, the father of Jared Kushner, Jared himself, and Javanka. And maybe Blinken serves a bit of a similar role when it comes to Israel's direct line into the White House. But again, that's what the conspiracy theorists would say. That's not nothing I would ever say. No.
Well, I mean, in many ways, Epstein's death and which was totally a suicide. Not a suicide. Sorry. I don't even know anymore. But one of the things that his death reminds me of within the context that you're framing this story is, another guy, Roy Cohn, who also knew Barr, but he too saw some of his fellow tribesmen that were expendable during the 50s for spying against America, uh, and on behalf of the Soviets at the time. These things are interesting, not just because sometimes they um, defy our understanding of how an in group would work, but also how that in group realizes that a certain strategy is over with. You could see this also happening, within the West, within European countries, and I just find that interesting that Epstein, um, no matter his membership, he had to go.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He was a loose end that needed to be tied up because, I'm convinced had Epstein not tragically taken his own life, he would have squealed like a pig under the first chance he got for any sort of plea deal. And oh boy, I'm really surprised. What, like, again, assuming we indulge the conspiracy theory that he was assassinated, I'm really surprised they didn't keep him alive and have him squeal a bunch of fake information, get him off and, send people down a bunch of rabbit holes that really lead to nowhere.
Hmm. Yeah, good point.
I suppose at the end of the day, it was safer for good old Jeffrey Epstein to go to the grave, 3 weeks after his previous suicide attempt, where he was on suicide watch again. We cover all the Epstein stuff. Everyone knows all the Epstein stuff. I think this goes all without saying. But point being is, even from the grave, his presence continues to haunt Western politics as a whole, and I don't think we've seen the end of this. I think everyone that comes up will have an either legitimate or illegitimate Epstein accusation, and I think a lot of the legitimate ones will be swept on the rug. Of course, a lot of people will turn this into this sort of they'll do what they do with this. They won't address the real issue. They won't address the ties to people like Robert Maxwell. They'll talk about Ghislaine Maxwell all day. They'll talk about him, her being Epstein's mistress and whatever. But rarely, if ever, will they tread on the territory of people like Robert Maxwell or Samuel Pizar
Hmm.
or going into Blinken or any of these other people because again that reveals too much that it gives away the game, so
Yeah,
to speak.
yeah, and it's also a game that in many ways it's quite complex, right? And they're also afraid that most people will not understand its complexity, anyways. Um,
Yeah, there's a reason we're allowed to talk about this on YouTube of all places. Let's just be clear about that.
yeah,
But I suppose with that being said, we have covered all we can for this week, I suppose. So thank you everyone for tuning into this, albeit delayed episode of the War Report. I hope you're having a nice day, evening, afternoon, night, whenever you're watching this. See you guys next time, and goodbye.
goodbye and take care.